On a sweltering afternoon in Timber Ridge, a woman stood on an auction block, sold to pay her father's gambling debts. A cruel foreman bid $300 and made clear what he wanted her for. The crowd did nothing. Then a quiet rancher nobody expected offered $400, his entire savings. He took her to his isolated ranch. She waited for the nightmare to begin. Instead, he gave her a locked door, left meals outside, slept on the floor to prove he wasn't prowling. What happened next would shatter every lie she'd ever been told about her worth. The afternoon sun beat down on Timber Ridge with a kind of cruelty that made even the horses lower their heads. Sarah Merrick stood on the splintered wooden platform outside Gaffney's general store, her hands trembling at her sides, her eyes fixed on a knot in the planking beneath her feet. She couldn't look up, couldn't bear to see the faces watching her like she was nothing more than a mare being shown for breeding stock. The auctioneer's voice droned through the list with mechanical efficiency. Gambling debts to the Cattleman's Syndicate, $4 to $7. Unpaid loan to Mr. Gaffney's Mercantile, $9 to $2. Outstanding bar tabs at the Silver Spur, $18. On and on it went. Each number another nail in the coffin of a father's ruin. Each debt another piece of a dignity stripped away in front of the town that had once known her as Samuel Merrick's daughter, back when that name meant something other than shame. $340 total. That's what her freedom cost. That's what she was worth now. Her dress, the only one she still owned, hung torn at the shoulder from where Gaffney's man had grabbed her that morning, dragging her from the storage room where they kept her for 2 weeks like spoiled grain. The bruises on her wrists showed purple-black against her pale skin, souvenirs from the ropes they'd used the first 3 nights when she tried to run. She didn't try anymore. There was nowhere to go. No family. No friends willing to risk Gaffney's displeasure. No money. No horse. No hope. The crowd pressed close in the heat, ranch hands with cruel eyes and crueler laughs. Townspeople who'd once greeted her father on Sunday mornings now studying their boots. A few women whispering behind their hands but doing nothing, saying nothing. Dust swirled through the gaps between bodies, coating everything in grit. Somewhere down the street, the saloon doors swung open and released a burst of piano music and drunken laughter, grotesque against the quiet horror of what was happening here. "Do I hear 200? The auctioneer called. A hand shot up, then another. The bids climbed with sickening speed. 220, 250, 280. Then Voss stepped forward. Sarah's stomach lurched. She'd seen him twice during her captivity, both times when he'd come to inspect the merchandise, as Gaffney put it. He was a foreman for the Broken Creek Ranch, thick-shouldered and mean, with eyes that crawled over her like insects. He'd made it clear what kind of work he had in mind, and it had nothing to do with cooking or laundry. 300, Voss announced, his voice carrying across the platform. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust and grinned. "That ought to cover it." 300, the auctioneer repeated. "Do I hear 320? Silence. The crowd shifted, uncomfortable now but still complicit in their stillness. Voss climbed the platform steps, his boots heavy on the wood. Sarah's breath came shallow and fast. He walked a slow circle around her, and she forced herself not to move, not to run, because running only made it worse. His hand shot out and grabbed her chin, rough fingers digging into her jaw as he turned her face toward the light. "Bit scrawny," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "but I reckon she'll break in proper once she learns her place." Laughter rippled through some of the men. Sarah's vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. 300 going once, the auctioneer said. This was it. This was how her life ended. Not in death, but in something worse. Owned, used, destroyed slowly in ways that wouldn't leave marks the law cared about. 300 going twice. 400. The voice came from the back of the crowd, calm and clear as church bells on Sunday morning. Sarah barely heard the new bid. The number, 400, meant nothing in the roar of memory that flooded through her skull. She was back in her mother's kitchen 3 years ago, watching her father's hands shake as he promised, again, that this time would be different, that he'd stop, that the poker games at the Silver Spur were just a way to unwind after surveying jobs, nothing more. Her mother had believed him every time, right up until the fever took her on a cold March morning. After that, Her father didn't even bother lying anymore. Samuel Merrick had been good once. Respected. He'd surveyed half the ranch boundaries in the county, his maps so precise that land disputes were settled with his word alone. But grief hollowed him out like rotten timber. The night after they buried Sarah's mother, he went to the Silver Spur and didn't come home for 3 days. When he finally stumbled through the door, he'd lost $60 he didn't have. It only got worse. Sarah worked herself raw trying to fill the hole he dug. She took in sewing, mending torn shirts, and hemming dresses for the town's few respectable women. She did laundry for the boarding house, her hands cracking and bleeding in the lye soap. She kept her father's survey books, managing his dwindling appointments, collecting payment from clients he was too drunk or ashamed to face. She learned every number in those ledgers, every debt mounting like storm clouds on the horizon. But her wages couldn't match his losses. He borrowed from Gaffney's Mercantile, from a cattleman's syndicate, from the owner of Broken Creek Ranch where Voss worked. He promised Sarah every time, swore on her mother's grave, that he'd win it back, that one good night would set everything right. There was no good night, only more debt, more shame, more nights when Sarah lay awake listening to him weep in the next room, drowning in guilt he couldn't face sober. When the horse threw him last autumn, drunk again, riding too fast on a trail he'd surveyed 100 times, Sarah felt something crack inside her that wasn't grief. It was almost relief. At least now the falling would stop. She was wrong. The creditors came before her father was cold in the ground. Gaffney arrived first with his ledgers and his thin smile, adding up numbers with the enthusiasm of a man counting a good harvest. The house went first, sold for a fraction of its worth. Her mother's wedding ring, her grandmother's quilt, the small daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day, all seized and sold. They even took her sewing machine, the one thing that had kept her fed. "You've got 2 choices," Gaffney told her in his cold, businesslike way. "We auction your labor contract, legal and proper, or we turn you over to Voss directly as settlement in kind. His boss holds a $100 note. Voss says he'll take you as payment." Sarah chose the auction. At least there was a chance, slim, desperate, that someone decent might bid. A family needing a housekeeper. A widow needing help with children. Anyone but Voss. They locked her in Gaffney's storage room behind the Mercantile to protect their investment. Dirt floor. One thin blanket. A bucket in the corner that stank by the second day. They fed her watery soup and stale bread once a day, shoved through a gap in the door like she was a dog. At night, she heard rats scratching in the walls and men's voices outside, sometimes laughing, sometimes making comments about what she'd be worth for different kinds of work. Voss came twice. The first time, he just looked at her, his eyes moving over her body with an assessment that made her skin crawl. The second time, he leaned close to the door gap and told her exactly what he'd teach her once the auction was done. How he'd break her in proper like the stubborn mares at Broken Creek. How she'd learn her value quick enough. After that, the men watching the storage room started saying it too. Worthless. Only good for one thing. Better get used to it. The words burrowed into her skull like parasites, repeating until she almost believed them. What value did she have? She couldn't save her father. Couldn't pay his debts. Couldn't even keep her mother's ring. Maybe they were right. Maybe this was all she was worth. $340 of labor and whatever else men decided to take. The crowd turned as one body, necks craning to see who'd spoken. Sarah's eyes followed despite herself, tracking the movement through the sea of faces until they landed on a man standing at the back, hat in his hands, dust on his boots like he'd ridden hard to get here. James Collier. She recognized him vaguely. He came to town maybe once a month for supplies, always paid in cash, always left quickly. He ran a horse ranch somewhere out past the Miller place, 8 miles or so into the hills. She'd heard he'd lost his wife some years back, but the details were fuzzy. He wasn't the kind of man people gossiped about much because he never gave them reason to. $400, James repeated, his voice steady but not loud. He didn't push through the crowd so much as let it part around him, his presence somehow creating space without demanding it. When he reached the platform, he met Voss's glare with something that wasn't quite a challenge, but wasn't submission either. Just a man stating a fact. Voss's jaw tightened. That's more than the debt requires. You trying to make a point? Collier, I'm making a bid. James's tone held no heat, no moral superiority. Just simple declaration. Legal auction. Legal bid. The auctioneer cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable but bound by the rules. 400 is the bid. Do I hear 420? Voss looked like he wanted to spit, but his eyes calculated quickly. 400 was steep for labor he could get cheaper elsewhere. His interest in Sarah had never been about her work ethic. He'd wanted her specifically because she was broken enough not to fight, vulnerable enough that no one would care what happened to her. But bidding higher now would expose that intent too clearly, even for Timber Ridge flexible morals. This ain't over, Voss said quietly, the words meant for James alone. Then he stepped back, and Sarah felt something loosen in her chest that might have been hope if she'd had any left to feel. Sold to James Collier for $400. James climbed the platform steps and pulled a leather wallet from his coat. He counted out the bills with methodical precision, his entire savings from a horse sale 2 weeks ago, money he'd planned to use for winter feedstock. He signed the labor contract papers without reading them closely, his handwriting surprisingly neat for a rancher. Then he turned to Sarah for the first time and looked at her, not through her, not at parts of her, but at her face like she was a person he was addressing. You'll work my ranch until the debt's cleared, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Then you're free to go or stay as you choose. Your decision. Sarah said nothing. Couldn't. She searched his face for the lie, for the trap, for whatever version of Voss's intentions he was hiding behind polite words. But his expression remained neutral, not kind, not cruel, just matter of fact. A transaction completed. He gestured toward a wagon waiting down the street. Sarah walked ahead of him on shaking legs, aware of every eye following her, every whisper starting before she'd even cleared the platform. The wagon was simple, weather-worn, with a single horse in the traces. James offered his hand to help her up. She didn't take it, hauling herself onto the bench seat with her own strength, such as it was. James climbed up on the other side and took the reins. Sarah pressed herself against the far edge of the bench, as much distance as the small space allowed. Her body was rigid, coiled tight with the expectation of when, not if, he'd reach for her. He didn't. Just clicked his tongue and guided the horse down Timber Ridge's main street, past the mercantile where Gaffney watched from the doorway, past the Silver Spur where men stood on the porch tracking their progress, past the smaller homes on the edge of town where curtains twitched in windows. The prairie opened up before them, golden and endless under the brutal sun. The ride would take 2 hours, maybe more. James didn't speak, didn't look at her, just kept his eyes on the horizon and let the silence stretch between them like the land itself, vast and uncertain and offering no promises Sarah could believe in yet. The room James showed her was small, barely 8 feet square, tucked off the main cabin like an afterthought. It had been storage once. She could see the nail holes in the walls where shelves had hung. But he cleaned it thoroughly, set up a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, placed a washstand with a chipped basin in the corner. And on the door, gleaming new against the weathered wood, was a bolt lock mounted on the inside. Lock it every night, James said, standing in the doorway but not crossing the threshold. I sleep in the main room by the stove. You're safe here. Sarah stayed at the lock. It was a simple thing. Just a metal bar that slid into a bracket, but it meant she could choose, could seal herself in, could keep him out. The concept felt foreign, dangerous even, like a trap that would spring shut the moment she believed in it. That first night, she tested it 17 times, sliding the bolt across, pulling it back, sliding it again, listening for his footsteps, for the creak of floorboards that would signal he was coming to remove this illusion of safety. But the only sounds were the settling of the cabin, the wind through gaps in the walls, and eventually, after what felt like hours, the low, rumbling sound of snoring from the main room. He was actually sleeping, or pretending to, which seemed like an elaborate deception for a man who already owned her labor contract. She slept in her dress, shoes within reach, back against the wall where she could see the door. Every sound jerked her awake, a coyote's distant howl, the creak of settling timber, her own breathing too loud in the darkness. But James never came. In the morning, She found a tray outside her door. Biscuits, fried eggs, coffee in a tin cup. Still warm. She heard his boots on the porch, moving away, giving her space to take the food without being watched. She ate mechanically, tasting nothing, half convinced the food was laced with something that would make her compliant. But nothing happened. Just food. Just sustenance. The pattern repeated. Every morning, a tray outside her door. A single knock, then his footsteps retreating. Meals left where she could take them without confrontation. He never lingered, never watched, never commented on whether she ate or left it untouched. During the day, he showed her the ranch work with the same careful distance. The chicken coop behind the cabin, where she'd gather eggs each morning. The vegetable garden, struggling but alive, where she'd pull weeds and water when the sun wasn't too fierce. The tack room in the barn, where leather harnesses and bridles needed mending. He'd demonstrated each task once, clearly and without condescension, then worked alongside her but never hovering, never correcting her harshly when she fumbled, never standing too close. He trained horses in the corral, 4 of them, in various stages of breaking. She watched from a distance as he worked with a gray mare, his movements patient and unhurried, talking to the animal in a low voice she couldn't quite hear. When he noticed her watching, he didn't perform or explain, just continued his work like her presence was ordinary, unremarkable. She tested him in small ways her captivity had taught her, dropped a plate while washing dishes, watched it shatter on the floor, waited for the explosion, the backhanded strike, the punishment that always followed broken things. James looked up from the harness he was mending, assessed the damage, and simply fetched a broom. Swept it up himself without a word. Another day, she asked if she could write a letter to a distant cousin in Missouri, a woman she hadn't spoken to in 5 years but who represented the only family connection she had left. She expected refusal, suspicion, maybe confiscation of paper and ink so she couldn't communicate with the outside world. Instead, James pulled writing materials from a drawer and set them on the table. Post rider comes through Miller's place every Thursday, he said. I'll take it when it's ready. She wrote nothing that day, just stayed at the blank paper, testing whether he'd demand to read it, whether this too was theater. He never asked. The 3rd week, Clara Brennan arrived in mid-morning, riding a bay gelding with the ease of someone who'd been in a saddle since childhood. She was perhaps 55, weathered and strong, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. She carried fresh bread wrapped in cloth and treated Sarah's presence like it was the most natural thing in the world. James mentioned he had help now, Clara said, settling at the table without invitation, the way old friends do. Figured I'd come introduce myself properly. I'm Clara. My husband Ben and I run the place across the valley. She gestured vaguely eastward, where Sarah could see another ranch house in the distance, small against the endless prairie. They talked, or rather, Clara talked and Sarah listened, her voice rusty from disuse. Clara mentioned casually that James had helped deliver a difficult calf last spring when Ben had been thrown from a horse and couldn't manage it. Talked about how James always paid his hands fair, how he'd helped rebuild the Johnson's barn after a fire 2 summers ago. There's a quilting circle at my place every other Saturday, Clara said as she prepared to leave. You're welcome anytime you're ready. No pressure. Just whenever. The invitation was extended like Sarah was a person with choices, not property with obligations. The distinction cracked something in her chest she'd thought sealed shut. When James was kicked by a spooked horse in the 4th week, a solid blow to the ribs that left him pale and struggling to breathe normally, Sarah saw him trying to lift hay bales the next morning and watched him barely suppress a gasp of pain. She didn't think. Thinking would have stopped her. You're hurt, she said. The first word she'd spoken to him directly in 3 weeks. I'm fine. You're not. She took the hay bale from his hands, her arms shaking with the weight but managing. I can do this. He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. Then he nodded once and stepped back, letting her work. For 3 days, Sarah took over the heavier tasks while James healed, moving carefully around his broken ribs. She didn't do it because she trusted him. She did it because the ranch needed running, because she'd watched him long enough to believe he wouldn't punish initiative, and because some small, fragile part of her had started to believe that maybe, This place operated by different rules than the ones she'd learned. They came at dusk, when the light turned everything amber and uncertain. Sarah was drawing water from the well when she heard the horses, 4 of them, moving fast enough to kick up dust visible against the dying sun. Her hands froze on the rope. She knew that sound, the particular rhythm of men riding with purpose, not leisure. She dropped the bucket and ran for the cabin, her boots slipping on the dry ground. She slammed the door behind her and threw the bolt, her breath coming in sharp gasps that had nothing to do with the short sprint. Through the window, she watched them approach. Voss in front, 3 ranch hands flanking him, all armed. The brief safety she'd started to believe in crumbled like sun-rotted wood. This was it. The moment the illusion ended. James emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his trousers, his movements slower than usual. His ribs were healing but not healed, and she could see the careful way he held himself, protecting the injury. He stepped into the yard and positioned himself between the riders and the cabin, a human barrier that seemed pitifully inadequate against 4 mounted men. Collier. Voss reined his horse to a stop 10 feet away, close enough to intimidate, far enough to stay mounted. Got some business to settle. We settled our business 6 weeks ago at the auction. Jamesy's voice carried steady across the yard, but Sarah could see his hands at his sides, fingers flexing. Contract signed and legal. See, that's where you're wrong. Voss leaned forward in his saddle, his smile all teeth and no warmth. Gaffney had prior claim on the girl. You interfered with existing debt arrangements. Contracts invalid. It was a lie? Or at best a distortion so thin it wouldn't hold up in any legitimate court. But out here, 8 miles from town with night falling, legitimate courts didn't matter. Only force did. The auctioneer accepted my bid. Papers were signed proper. James didn't move, didn't raise his voice. You on my land now, Voss. I'm asking you to leave. Voss laughed, a sound like gravel scraping metal. Heard you've been treating her soft, not working her proper. Makes a man wonder what kind of work you've got her doing instead. He spat into the dirt. That ain't right, Collier. Girl like that needs fame handling. Needs to remember what she's worth. She's worth a damn sight more than you'll ever understand. Is that so? Voss's expression darkened. Because I heard different. Heard she's nothing but a drunk's daughter. Worthless except for what men will pay. And I'm here to collect what I'm owed. Inside the cabin, Sarah pressed her back against the wall, her whole body shaking. The words hit like physical blows. Whore's daughter. Worthless. What men will pay. The same word from the storage room. The same dehumanization she'd almost started to forget. Voss was right. This was what she was. What she'd always be. James had been kind, but kindness didn't change reality. Outside, Jamesy's hands were shaking now. Not from fear, Sarah realized with sudden clarity, but from rage so tightly controlled it made his whole frame rigid. You'll have to go through me, James said, his voice low and deadly calm. Voss looked at him, really looked, and his smile widened. You're hurt. Favor those ribs. And you alone. He gestured to his men. Wherefore? How you figure this plays out? Collier. James said nothing. Because there was nothing to say. He couldn't win this fight, and everyone in that yard knew it. But he didn't step aside. Didn't move. Just stood there like a man who'd already decided what he was willing to die for. The moment stretched taut as a rope about to snap. Then hoofbeats, more of them, coming fast from the east. Ben Brennan crested the rise with 2 other ranchers Sarah recognized from the quilting circle visit, all 3 men armed and grim-faced. They didn't charge in dramatically, just rode up steady and deliberate, forming a line beside James. Evening, Voss. Ben's voice was conversational, almost friendly. Almost. Saw you and your boys riding toward James's place. Figured we'd come see what the urgency was. Voss's smile faltered. Private business, Brennan. Don't look private. Looks like 4 men threatening one on his own land. Ben shifted in his saddle, his hand resting casual on his rifle. We know James. Known him years. Good man. Fair man. Helps his neighbors when they need it. We know you too, Voss. Know your reputation. He paused. Contract's legal. You're trespassing now. Seems simple enough. The other two ranchers said nothing, but their presence spoke volumes. This wasn't about the law. Not really. This was about community deciding who deserved protection and who didn't. Years of James's quiet decency, his unglamorous kindness, his willingness to help deliver a difficult calf or rebuild a burned barn. All of it was being repaid in this moment. Not with speeches or sentiment, but with bodies positioned between him and violence. Voss looked at the odds, recalculated. His jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "This ain't over," he said finally, yanking his horse's head around. Not by a long shot. They left in a cloud of dust and fury, hoofbeats fading into the gathering darkness. The neighbors stayed until they were certain Voss wouldn't circle back, then took their leave with handshakes and quiet words Sarah couldn't hear from inside. When the yard was finally empty, Sarah unbolted the door on shaking legs. James sat on the porch steps, his head in his hands, shoulders heaving with breaths that clearly hurt his ribs. The adrenaline was leaving him in waves, and with it the strength that had kept him upright. She sat beside him on the step, not touching, but close enough that her presence was deliberate. For a long moment, neither spoke. "You could have given me back," Sarah said quietly. "Would have been safer for you." James lifted his head, and in the dim light she saw something raw in his expression. "No," he said, "that's not who I choose to be. Not again." The words hung heavy with meaning she didn't understand yet. But she didn't ask. Just sat with him in the dark while his breathing steadied and the prairie wind carried away the dust of what had almost happened. Later, after Ben and Clara had returned briefly to check on them and left again, after Sarah had retreated to her room and bolted the door from habit more than fear, she heard James's footsteps approach. He didn't knock, just stood on the other side of the wood, and she could picture him there, head bowed, one hand perhaps pressed against the doorframe. Her name was Rachel, he said, his voice muffled but clear enough. "My wife. She had a difficult pregnancy. The midwife said she needed to stay off her feet. Take it easy. But I had to buy her for 3 horses 2 towns over. Good money when needed for winter. I thought I'd be gone 3 days." He paused, and she heard him take a careful breath. "She went into labor early. Something went wrong. By the time I got back, she and our son were already buried." Sarah pressed her hand against the door, tears streaming silently down her face. "I chose business over family," James continued. "Told myself it was for us, for our future. But the truth is I could have sent someone else. Could have stayed. I didn't, and they died because I wasn't there." Another pause. "I couldn't save them. But I could. I could stand between you and Voss. Even if it cost everything. I had to. Because that's who I need to be now." He didn't say more. His footsteps retreated, leaving Sarah alone in the dark with the weight of his confession and the understanding that his kindness to her had never been about her at all. Not at first. It had been about redemption for ghosts she'd never met, for failures that haunted him still. But somehow, that made it more real, more human, more believable than if he'd claimed to be her savior. 3 months after Voss rode away in fury, Sarah's debt was cleared. James showed her the contract one morning, stamped and signed, her labor fulfilled down to the last dollar. He set it on the table between them like an offering, like proof that she could leave if she wanted. She looked at it for a long moment, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer with the writing paper she still hadn't used. She stayed, not because the contract bound her, not because she had nowhere else to go, though that remained true. She stayed because the ranch had become something she recognized. Not home, not yet, but a place where her presence mattered in ways that had nothing to do with ownership or debt. She'd taken over the horse training books after James admitted, sheepishly, that his record-keeping was a mess of notes that made sense 6 months ago. She'd organized the breeding records, tracked expenses and sales, discovered she had a gift for the numbers and details James found tedious. The business side of the ranch, neglected for years, began to function with something approaching efficiency. She gained weight. Not much, but enough that her dresses no longer hung loose on her frame. Enough that Clara commented approvingly during one of Sarah's now regular visits to the quilting circle. She slept most nights without bolting the door. Though it stayed closed, some boundaries took longer to cross than others. She occasionally smiled when James made dry observations about the gray May's stubbornness or the rooster's inflated sense of importance. Small things. Ordinary things. The kind of life she'd stopped believing was possible. One evening in late autumn, they sat on the porch watching the sun sink toward the distant hills, painting the prairie sky in shades of amber and rose. The air carried the first hint of winter's coming cold. James whittled a piece of wood into something that might eventually be a fence post, while Sarah mended a tear in his work shirt. "I thought I had no value," she said suddenly, the words surprising her as much as him. "My father told me so when he was drunk. Gaffney told me so. Voss told me so." She set down the mending, her hands unsteady. "I believed them." James stopped whittling. He turned to face her fully, and after a moment's hesitation, the first time he'd initiated touch in all these months, he reached out and took her hand. His grip was gentle, warm, his palm calloused from years of ranch work. "They were all wrong," he said, his voice quiet but steady, carrying what she'd come to recognize as his particular brand of courage. Not loud or showy, just honest and present. "Your worth isn't something they could take or I could give. You had it all along. I just saw it when others chose not to." Sarah looked at their joined hands, at the rough skin and scars that told stories of labor and survival. She squeezed back, tentative, testing whether this too might be an illusion that would shatter. But his hand remained solid, real, offering no false promises of perfection, but something more valuable: presence, partnership, the slow accumulation of days that might eventually become a life. She didn't quite believe his words yet. The lies she'd been told had roots too deep to pull out in a single season. But she was beginning to understand that worth wasn't earned through suffering or granted by others' approval, but existed independent of what had been done to her or what she'd survived. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness gathered, two damaged people who'd found each other not through destiny or romance, but through the messy, unglamorous work of choosing decency when cruelty was easier. The ranch stretched around them, theirs now in the ways that mattered, not through ownership papers or legal claims, but through shared labor, honest vulnerability, and the fragile, precious hope that maybe, in this harsh world, they'd carved out something decent enough to keep.